Throughout heavy metal history, there has been a huge debate about the big four of thrash metal. Four of the bands that were responsible for heavy metal becoming king, especially in America during the 1980s. Metallica, Megadeth, Slayer, and Anthrax. A weird coupling, actually. One of these things, in many people's opinions, is not like the other, and that's Anthrax. Why were these bands, specifically, the big four of thrash metal in America? What was the selection process? What was that all about? Well, it's actually kind of simple and in many ways kind of boring. These are the four bands that really had the most sales. They were the bands that had the music videos that were circulating around in the MTV culture, the ones that were recognizable to just about any person who happened to be a heavy metal fan and a thrash metal fan especially. Now, most have said that they want to reformat the Big Four, that the Big Four is a bad representation of thrash metal. Anthrax should be removed, or this band should be removed, or that band, whatever. It's a 30-year debate that still rages on, but I'm going to actually go one step further with it. I'm going to tell you that the Big Four could actually be the Big Six, maybe even the Big Seven. We'll see where this debate takes us. So in the 1980s, whenever thrash metal was king, we did have this very select foursome that seemed to be the ones that were the paramount of the genre. The four bands that seemed to have the most opinion or fans, and those are the four bands that we just listed. Metallica, Megadeth, Slayer, Anthrax. It was like a mantra. However, the debate started just as soon as this four was labeled. It said that Anthrax shouldn't be a part of this, because Anthrax was almost like an equal opportunity hire. They were from the East Coast, the other three were all stationed in the West, in California to be exact. They were part of that scene, that Bay Area basher scene. And this does seem a little bit odd. It seems strange, especially whenever you consider the Teutonic thrash metal Big Four of Sodom, Creator, Tankard, and Destruction. This is one that's all centered within the same country. It makes sense. It's condensed and it's all in one region. With this one, for the Big Four for American thrash metal, it's in two different regions. There's only one band that's representative of the East Coast. So how would we redesign this? Which bands would actually be a better fit for the Big Four? Well, who cares about that? Which bands should we include to make this a Big Six? And I think that these are the two most obvious selections. Although one, I would actually debate and would actually just say the hell with it and make it a Big Seven. The two bands I would select would be Testament and Exodus. Exodus is an easier sell for me, surprisingly enough, between the two. Despite the fact that their sales figures may not match up with those of the four classics that we have already discussed, this is a band that's extremely important to the formation of thrash metal, not to mention the formation of what heavy metal was to become within that decade. Exodus started in 1979, so they are one of the earliest thrash metal bands in existence. They actually predate Metallica in that regard. They were a bit different whenever they started off, but as they honed their sound, it became thrash metal oriented. It had that punk exterior, it had that speed, it had that, guitar intensity. They're a great choice, despite the fact that their career has actually seen more of a resurgence in the 2000s and the 2010s. Perhaps that's the reason why this is a band that was never fully considered for that for that foursome, right? Maybe that's the reason why. Despite the fact that they were red hot during the latter end of the 1980s, sometimes they even got lumped in with the second wave as opposed to the first, which is completely incorrect. This is a band that has early origins, in fact earlier than some of those Big Four bands. I believe they're an important addition to this, especially if we're making a modern list in 2019 or 2020, and we're trying to really reflect thrash metal for a bit of its history as well as the importance of its origins, considering Exodus does have that on lock. But the second choice would be Testament. Now, Testament, again, more so than Exodus, is fair to be assumed to be part of the second wave of thrash metal, considering they did come a couple of years removed from the origin of the other four. They were a little bit late to the party. However, Testament did have a lot of important and very creative albums that were thrash metal festivals, really throughout the latter part of the 1980s, moving into the first part of the 1990s. And really, they sort of followed some of the similar history that some of their counterparts also displayed within the Big Four. Now let's examine our history here for just a brief moment, a brief deviation if you will. What happened in the 1990s was that thrash and glam and metal in general was starting to become phased out and was being replaced by other genres such as grunge. Now, many people say grunge killed metal. They're wrong. That's a whole separate argument. It's a whole separate video. It's already been made. Don't ask for it. But this is something that caused the record labels and sometimes even the bands themselves to want to change up their sound, try things a little bit different. After Rust in Peace for Megadeth, for example, we got Countdown to Extinction, which was a very different sounding album, although they wouldn't go full on mainstream, quote unquote, until albums such as Cryptic Writings and Risk later on in the decade, but you could tell a marketed change. Same thing with Metallica. Despite the fact that the Black Album was not as commercial as, say, Load or Reload, or as different as Load or Reload, it was definitely a different sound, a bit more condensed, a bit more straightforward than albums such as Injustice for All. Same thing could be said about Slayer, who took a deviational tour throughout the 1990s to examine punk and other aspects that they really didn't sell out so much as their material just started to get a little bit more repetitive and a little less memorable. And Anthrax, they had a bit of a difficulty as well. Testament released The Ritual. And for that album, many people said that, well, they were getting on the sellout bandwagon. This was something that was more conventional, a little more modern, a little bit more groovy, a little bit less of that aggression, and a little bit more, kind of hooky. Some people would say the same thing about Carcass with an album such as Swan Song, but we're not talking about that genre. This is something that happened a lot in the 1990s, especially during the early portion of the decade, whenever metal was seeing itself losing out to other genres within the rankings. And now that they are a part of a big label, they had some things that they had to satisfy, which is unfortunate. It's one of the things that causes labels to get a lot of the flack and a lot of the shit that they do. However, Testament, despite this, was able to come back later on in that decade and release two albums that felt like they had a lot of that same fury, a lot of that same dimensional fury, anger, and power. They were a bit different in the process with an album such as The Gathering, but it was still one that showed a lot of promise, Demonic being the same way. And then whenever they come back in the 2000s, they're immediately the band that we formerly remember them as. And their contemporaries have returned with them. Exodus is back with them, releasing albums such as The Atrocity Exhibition or Shovel-Headed Killing Machine. We're now seeing that the Teutonic bands, which also took some deviations, especially Creator throughout the 90s, are back to their thrash-oriented ways with albums such as Violent Revolution and eventually Phantom Antichrist in the 2010s. So Testament seems like they're just along for the ride, and they're basically a better fit almost than Anthrax. It's weird, but I don't want to remove Anthrax. Anthrax's importance to the Big Four is very much based around what made them unique, what made them different. Because Anthrax had some crossover appeal. Anthrax had songs such as Bring the Noise or I'm the Man that were either a little bit more comedic based or had a little bit of that rap side going alongside. They were hand in hand. It was something that helped to make thrash metal feel a little bit more hip, a little bit more, in the now. It was something that was more focused on the present and the future instead of harboring negative ideas toward the past. And this is a band also that had that MTV appeal. But I would go one step further. I would maybe include one more band. And I would do this not so much as an equal opportunity, but to give the East Coast a little bit more credit. And that's because both Exodus and Testament, they're also West Coast bands. They're also bands from California. Anthrax right now is sitting there all by itself as the lone representative of the East Coast. And there is a dirty, grimy, slimy band from the East Coast that certainly deserves mention. And that is, of course, Overkill. Really, one could exchange, perhaps, Exodus and Overkill or Testament and Overkill in this Big Six idea, and you would not be any more wrong or right than somebody who decides to omit them. It's the best part about this. This is a list that was generated by media or generated by fans, and just the same, this revision is being generated by a fan to present to other fans. But Overkill is a band that, if we wanted to turn this thing into a Big Seven, Ocean 7, why did I cite that movie? That movie was terrible. They would be a perfect fit. Not only do they have that East Coast representation, so now Anthrax is not all by themselves, but also Overkill has legendary status, not to mention roots to the origin of thrash metal, with some of their earliest material coming out in the early 1980s, with their formation being right there at the edge of the 70s, first part of the 1980s. They have power, they have grime, they had attitude. Everything that was present within the big four thrash metal bands was present also in Overkill, and they actually took it one step further by seeming a little bit more dangerous and in your face. I mean, did Metallica have an album called Fuck You and Then Some? No, they had Metal Up Your Ass. Okay, so they're about on par. Did Overkill, though, have that similar idea in the 90s where some of their material fell off? Well, we have a rank 'em all that may prove one way or the other. However, there was a bit of a shift in the material. That started off with an album such as The Years of Decay. They had their own morphology. They had their own things that they took care of that made them unique. And plus, they are a band that is still cranking out material to this day. They never took any time off. There was no huge gaps. This is a group that has been plugging away in the underground for way longer than they should have been. And perhaps that's the reason why they got omitted. Because they were always seen more as an underground thrash icon instead of an above-ground, mainstream thrash dynasty. And I think that's wrong. I think that is incorrect. Really, whenever you consider the popularity and the importance of thrash metal to the heavy metal multiverse here in 2019, it's incredible that only 4 were seen as the big ones. There was such a lexicon. Whenever heavy metal and thrash metal became king, labels were starting to sign up any band that was thrash. Any band that even had a hint of it. You had groups such as Heathen or Onslaught that were able to further the design of extreme metal in some instances, such as Onslaught, or a band such as Heathen that at one point was able to sell 250,000 copies of one of their albums. But yet, whenever you talk about them in 2019, are sort of shrouded in obscurity. There were plenty of bands that could potentially have gotten on board and been seen as just as on equal and important footing as the 4 major ones. But these 4 are the ones that lasted forever. I would add the 3 that I added: Exodus, Testament, and Overkill. The hell with what the video says, I'd make this a big 7. What would you do though? Would you add? Would you subtract? How would you morph the big 4 of thrash metal? Let me know in the comments below. My name is CoverKillerNation, and I'll talk to you next time. Take care.